Of course, the actual text of the treaty is in two forms, an English language version and a Maori language version. Understandings of those versions, what was agreed and what honouring the treaty actually means in practice, is all subject for debate.
Good morning, you beautiful New Zealanders, not Aotearoa rights. This is New Zealand, not Aotearoa. Let's get that clear. Well, in the last video we established, as Jack Thames said, that in February 1840 there existed two documents of immense importance, the treaty in Maori and the final English draft of the treaty in English. In February 1840 these two documents were in perfect sync. You could say they were a mirror image of each other. There were no variations other than the two variations that I have mentioned in the two previous videos, so you have to watch those videos if you want to get what those variations are. Everything changed during March and April 1840. On the 1st of March, Hobson had a severe stroke and was incapacitated. He eventually died in 1842, so that tells you how sick the guy was. He was not in good shape. The British Surgeon General put it down to stress. Things began to unravel for the British in March and April 1840. When you know all the history, you know that that's true. Not only did Hobson suffer a stroke, but somehow, and no one knows exactly how, but the original draft of the treaty in English was lost. In her book on the treaty, Dr. Claudia Orange states that, quote, "The original draft in English on which Henry Williams based this Maori translation was not found. His original translation presented to the Waitangi meeting on the 5th of February has also disappeared," unquote. And there's the reference. With Hobson incapacitated, his personal secretary James Freeman played up. Now you remember that James Freeman was the guy that was given to Hobson when he visited Australia on his travels to New Zealand. Governor Gipps, the governor of Australia, gave him this guy called James Freeman as a secretary. As Bruce Moon put it, quote, "While the cat was away," that is when Hobson was sick, "while the cat was away, the mouse was playing." James Stewart Freeman, third-class clerk in the New South Wales government, was palmed off on Hobson by Governor Gipps as his private secretary. Incompetent, pretentious, arrogant. Amongst English signatories of the treaty, he uniquely signed himself J.A.S. Stewart Freeman, gentleman, unquote. Well, what does Bruce Moon mean when he says James Freeman played up? What does that mean? He means that when the final English draft of the treaty was lost, and while Hobson was desperately ill, remember he had a stroke on the 1st of March, Freeman started to write and distribute his own versions of the treaty in English. Historians call Freeman's version of the treaty, quote, flowery, because they were much more elaborate and wordy than the original final English draft or the treaty in Maori. Freeman's versions were based on the discarded notes that the treaty writers left around after they had finalised the draft treaty in English. That's before the Treaty of Waitangi was signed 6th of February. That's what happened. Well, how do we know that the final English draft of the treaty must have been lost at that early stage? That is, within only a few months of the Waitangi signing. How do we know it was lost? Well, think about it. If it had been available, surely Freeman would have used it as the basis for writing his treaty versions. Surely other British officials would have insisted on this. The British ordinarily were sticklers for detail and correct process. They were fastidious. So how is it that absolutely no one reined Freeman in? The only reasonable explanation is that Freeman was requested, quote, to produce more copies of the treaty in English because the original final draft could not be found. There are other unanswered questions too. For example, where was Henry Williams, the missionary who translated the final English draft into Maori at Waitangi? Well, that's a good question. Where was he? Why didn't he step in and say, well, let me check that? Why wasn't he called upon to check that James Freeman Rogue version, I've called it, JFRV? Why wasn't he called upon to check that the JFRV was faithful in every respect to the master copy of the treaty in Maori, the copy signed at Waitangi on the 6th of February 1840? Williams was lost in action. Freeman was incompetent. Hobson was terribly ill. When I said earlier that things started to unravel for the British in March and April 1840, now you can see what I mean. With the original English draft lost, Freeman began writing his own, quote, flowery versions of the treaty. Not having a final English draft to go on, he had to use the discarded notes of the treaty writers. And not knowing Maori, he could not do a back translation. So what's the net result? Well, the net result was that his treaties in English were markedly different from the treaty in Maori. In April 1840, a guy called Reverend Maunsell, one of the officials sent by Hobson to the Manukau Heads and Port Waikato area, was in possession of one of James Freeman's rogue versions of the treaty in English, written by Freeman. Maunsell had been sent by Hobson to harvest the signatures of chiefs in that area. So you get this guy called Reverend Maunsell, who was told in April to go and get signatures in the Manukau and Port Waikato area by Hobson. And he had in his pocket one of James Freeman's rogue versions of the treaty. This James Freeman rogue version was signed by Hobson. We can only presume that Hobson presumed that Freeman had put together an accurate reconstruction of the original final English draft, which had been lost. Hobson was too sick to notice or check that it was far from accurate. Now that is irregular for the British to do that, but he did it, so you imagine how sick Hobson was. Since the original English draft was lost, he had nothing with which to compare the Freeman rogue version presented to him. That's Hobson. And since Hobson could not speak or write Maori, he could not check Freeman's rogue version against the original treaty in Maori. See? He had nothing to go on. Okay, back to Maunsell, the man who was sent to the Waikato to harvest the signatures of chiefs for Hobson in April 1840. Maunsell not only had a James Freeman rogue version of the treaty on him, but he also had one of Colenso's 200 printed copies of the treaty in Maori. Remember I told you that? On the 17th of February, Colenso, the British printer, had printed 200 A4 size copies of the treaty in Maori to give out to the chiefs. This, i.e. the Maori version, he read to a gathering of chiefs in the Waikato and Manukau areas. There was discussion with the chiefs in Maori. Many more chiefs turned up to sign than expected. The A4 size Colenso copy of the treaty in Maori was insufficient in size to take all the signatures. So what happened? Well, Maunsell compromised by using the James Freeman rogue version of the treaty to capture the overflow of signatures. He just needed paper for the overflow of signatures. That was all. The chiefs understood and believed that when they signed the James Freeman rogue version, they were signing up to what they had heard in the Maori version, the Colenso version, that was read to them. They did not realize that these two versions, the Colenso A4 in Maori and the James Freeman rogue version in English, were very different in wording. Maori chiefs didn't realize. Colenso's A4 copy in Maori was a duplicate in wording with the treaty signed at Waitangi on the 6th of February 1840. You know what? The James Freeman rogue version was nothing like the treaty in Maori. Really, it was sloppy work by the British to have allowed all this to happen. This James Freeman rogue version should have been disqualified as a genuine treaty document because the wording on it was not what the chiefs understood they were signing. Come on. The British officials ought to have officially noted that the signatures were bona fide, but the English version they were signing was not. Only the treaty in Maori should ever have been permitted for the gathering of signatures. The fact that this James Freeman rogue version is the only one of the 9 copies of the treaty in English is a red flag to start with. Sensing there was a problem with this copy of the treaty, Hobson said the following, which is completely ignored by successive governments and by the Maori activists. Watch. The treaty, which forms the basis of my proceedings, was signed at Waitangi on the 6th of February 1840 by 52 chiefs, 26 of whom were of the Confederation, and formed a majority of those who signed the Declaration of Independence 1835. Now this is the important bit. This instrument I consider to be de facto, that means in reality or in fact the treaty, and all the signatures that are subsequently obtained are merely testimonials of adherence to the terms of the original document. Wow. That is so absolutely powerful. There's the reference. So I put that into my own wording. I've said this. If you signed a treaty document, no matter which one, no matter if there were differences between them in their wording, you were signing your adherence to the terms of the original February the 6th Waitangi document. There you go. You just can't get it any clearer than that. So really, Hobson was disqualifying that English version of the treaty that was signed at Manukau Heads in the Port Waikato because its wording was so different from the treaty in Maori. There you go. These two pieces of paper, the James Freeman Rogue version and the Colenso A4 treaty in Maori from the Waikato Heads and Manukau area, were wax sealed together and pinned. So you've got wax sealing and you've got pinning together of those documents. When these two documents arrived back at the treaty headquarters in Waitangi, they were stored. The story of what happened was always meant to stay with these two documents, but it didn't. Here's the problem. Over time, the two documents were separated from each other, and the story of how they came together was lost. Hobson, still sick and near death, had to send official copies of the treaty in English to Australia and England. Because the final English draft had been lost, all he had to go on was a James Freeman Rogue version. He had nothing else to send England and Australia. That's what happened. Maori activists pounced on the James Freeman Rogue version because it mentions forests and fisheries, whereas the treaty in Maori does not. In other words, Maori activists thought that they could get more cash and more assets by using the James Freeman Rogue version as the official treaty in English. You see, that's what it was about. James Freeman stuck a lot more stuff, if you like, in his versions than in the final English draft and in the treaty in Maori. It suited them perfectly, much better than the original English draft and the treaty in Maori, which, as I have said, were identical. Officially, from the 1840s onwards then, the James Freeman Rogue version of the treaty has been viewed as, quote, the official treaty in English. It is not. We know this for certain because the final English draft version of the treaty was eventually found. Can you believe it? Where it was found, when it was found, and how it was found is absolutely incredible, and I'm going to tell you about that in the next video, so get ready for that one. It's going to be a doozy. Okay, you might be thinking, why is Julian going on about the history of the final English draft of the treaty, and why is it so important? Well, I'll make 6 points. Just in case you missed some stuff, I want to make sure we get it. Number 1, the Waitangi Tribunal uses this English version of the treaty as the basis of payouts in settlements, particularly forests and fisheries. Forests and fisheries are not mentioned in the Maori version. The James Freeman Rogue version is the version used in the Treaty of Waitangi Act 1975 as the official treaty in English. Through this version, the activists are able to say, look, the treaty in English is so different from the treaty in Maori. Whoa, you translators did a bad job. You need Maori experts to tell you what the treaty in English really should be saying. See, it's a con. So that's how they do it. In this way, they've been able to, quote, interpret the treaty, giving it meaning it did not have originally, meaning that suits their purpose, that is to get cash and assets belonging to all New Zealanders. It's been the source of tremendous corruption for the last 50 years. So what's the solution? Well, now that the final English draft has been found, it must be reinstated as the official final English draft of the treaty. This eliminates the need for the so-called, quote, Maori expert translators, thus cuts off the means which they have been using to shaft the country of assets and cash. Maori need to return all the forests and fisheries which have been given to them through settlements. These need to be returned to public ownership. Go through this video with your children and grandchildren. It's crucial that they know the truth about our history. It's so important that we counter all the grooming and brainwashing going on in our schools and universities. It's so intense now, and our workplaces, with respect to the treaty. By the way, you can download a script of this video, all the words in this video, from the description. It's in the description of this video. So I'll see you next time. Be sure to subscribe, like, and share this video. Thanks so much. You guys are absolutely awesome. Thank you for your support. Have a great night. Please share this video with everyone everywhere. The mainstream media should be reporting on the issues I am raising in these videos, but they're not. Why aren't they? Well, they're corrupt. Why are they corrupt? They are collaborating with Maori activists. There's no doubt about that. In the final analysis, the people of New Zealand, that's us, have ultimate power, not the politicians. Did you know that? The people can kick out the people in power and they can put them into power. How are we going to do that? Well, awareness is the key to change. If enough people in New Zealand become aware of the issues I am raising, we can save this beautiful country. So share these videos everywhere. so that come the next election, we can vote the right people in and kick out the people who are destroying New Zealand.